Welcome to Milestones. I'm Mike Johnson, and joining me today is co-host Dr. Dwayne Neal, OBE. Milestones is the podcast that has been reviewing the significant contributions made in the UK black community since 1948. In this series, Series 2, The Windrush Nation, we're taking an inclusive approach by expanding the list of contributors to include people whose heritage is from the Caribbean, Africa, and black British individuals with a dual heritage.
Okay, Mike, thank you for that introduction, and it's a pleasure, as always, to be working with you. Milestone Series 2 is very close to my heart because we're talking about our community, and we're showing all of those wonderful contributors from the three main channels that we have. And we're very fortunate to have Rob Neal with us as as the guest contributor for this episode. Rob, why don't you briefly introduce yourself, my friend?
Oh, well, thank you very much. And thank you to Life UK. Thanks for having me. It's wonderful to be here. My name's Rob Neal. I'm the son of Jamaican parents. My dad arriving in 58, my mum shortly after in 62. And I was born in Paddington. After my birth, I grew up in northwest London. And whilst there was a short spell, literally for 365 days, 1 year, straddling a calendar year, with my wife, we lived in Milton Keynes. I've spent all of my lived life in and around London directly. I'm a former civil servant where I worked amongst many a politician, serving most of my 38 years at the Ministry of Justice. I let go of my beloved civil service 3 years ago, working at the Department for Education. I now run my own consultancy. We're called Crystal Alliance. That's Crystal with a K, if anyone of our listeners want to look us up, crystalalliance.co.uk. Have a little splash around there. And predominantly working with members and organisations across all sectors, public, private and voluntary or charitable, around equality, diversity and inclusion. And it's a real labour of love.
Okay, thanks.
Lovely.
Rob. You mentioned Milton Keynes. I've got to pick you up there because that's where I am. So
okay.
Whereabouts in Milton Keynes were you?
Oh, wonderful, Mike. A wonderful bit of coincidence there. We lived in on a road called Westwood Close, number 43 it was, end of terrace, built from new, but in a place called Great Home.
Okay, yes. Because London...
We measured it, Mike, as 9 roundabouts in off the M1.
That's how I used to give my instructions to visitors.
Yes.
The 4th roundabout, do a left.
That's right. Exactly that. But the 9 roundabouts would take us through the edge of the point, the actual centre, and on about 3 roundabouts on. A lovely place called Great Home. It was before we had our children. We have a daughter and a son. And it was us trying to live somewhere else and exercising some form of social mobility, I guess.
And you were only 40 minutes away from central London on the train.
On a good day, Mike. Yes, on a good day. Notwithstanding HS2 connections or not.
Lovely. So if we could dive into the episode, we are actually going to be talking about politics from the standpoint of contributions by people from our community, our Windrush Nation. Gentlemen, we have 2 other folks that we would like to feature. And having had that wonderful discussion around Patricia Scotland, let me ask us to consider Kwasi Kwarteng. And of course, he will be fresh in all our minds for reasons I'm sure we will touch on. But what struck me in looking at the research about this young man of Ghanaian parents and born in London is just how bright he was from the get-go. You know, Eton educated, Trinity College, Cambridge educated, worked in a number of areas But even before he did that, he went on to get himself a PhD in economic history at Cambridge. So that clearly is a powerhouse. And we will talk about the other things he's done before we talk about his political career and perhaps his faux pas. But he's also a publisher of several books.
Yes.
So we are talking about a gentleman of Ghanaian background who is no intellectual lightweight.
No.
He's a heavyweight. Let me pause it there.
Well, you've chosen the apt words there, Dwayne. Absolutely a heavyweight. As you say, an author, and I happen to have read perhaps his most well-known book, Ghosts of Empire, which he wrote when he was but 37 years old. This is a man who's not yet 50, Dwayne. He's not yet 50.
1977, 75 born. Absolutely.
Exactly. 26th of May. And born in London. I think always interested in politics from the earliest age. Initially a commentator on politics rather than someone who was actively engaged with it, but nonetheless more insightful because of that. I mentioned at the top of the show that I've worked with all three of our guests under the spotlight. Kwasi's who I've least worked with. I've worked with him on two conferences, and one of them chaired the discussion in that exchange. But in the way it works within the civil service, certainly back then, I'm 3 years out the swim now, so I can't be certain of some of the protocol, but certainly back then, there were all series of briefings, pre-meets, and indeed a synchronicity that was reached for in terms of how you then present, a bit like how you might be preparing for some of your shows, Mike. And so it was fascinating to get an insight into that powerhouse of a mind, Dwayne. And you can't help sometimes but compare with other secretaries of state. And when you look at some of his achievements, which were edging towards some of them notable, some of them perhaps he might want to forget, but he still goes down in the record books, and perhaps a milestone he'd want to let go of as being the shortest serving Chancellor of the Exchequer. I say shortest serving. There was Ian MacLeod back in the 70s who reigned for 7 days less, but actually died in office of a heart attack. Kwasi was sacked after 38 days because of the impact and some of the fallout with his partnership with Liz Truss in some of the decisions made. But going back to his book, Dwayne, Ghosts of Empire, I don't know if you've read it. Have either of you read that one?
No.
Okay.
I've certainly not read it, but I get the impression it would be a good read because clearly he was a guy who's incredibly knowledgeable.
Well, if my review counts for anything, but let me declare his politics are as far from my own as is possible, but it's a cracking read. Why? Because in it he coins a wonderful phrase called anarchic individualism. And what this book does, Dwayne, which I think will tickle you, knowing the historian in you, is he brings center stage 6 of Britain's former colonies: Iraq, Kashmir, Burma, Sudan, Hong Kong, and Nigeria. And he not only puts them under the microscope, Mike, he dissects them to reveal that far from the thought that some folk have about British Empire being this coordinated, highly efficient, grip on the world, and you know where it's going, Dwayne, don't you? We've got this kind of ego-driven, power-hungry phases and era of leadership, and he refers to it as anarchic individualism. And he breaks it down in such a way, and I think this is one of his more credible milestones. I say that with bias in play. I think what Kwasi gave certainly the Conservative Party was an insight from someone whose heritage had come from somewhere else, but was telling them about themselves, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. And I think he did it in such an engaging way. I not only recommend the book, but it gave me an additional lens on which I could communicate with Kwasi, because as I say, and as I declare, his politics are about as far removed from my own personal politics as they could be. But as a trained civil servant working under the Nolan principles, I know not to have that come out in my work. And I'd like to think for all of my time in the civil service, I remain professional. I'm just a bit freer now, and I can say a bit more than I used to.
Sure. Mike, any thoughts from your side on Kwasi?
Well, he came came to my attention. I was watching him during the election campaigning for the leadership, when he supported Truss and so on. And it's amazing how it unfolded when she was under pressure and she asked, did you support, was this your idea, this budget, these tax cuts? No, it was the Chancellor's. I thought, ooh.
Yeah, bus and under come to mind.
Oh, absolutely. Curb as well.
Mike, wasn't it? I got, my hairs went up. I couldn't believe it was like theatre, wasn't it?
Yeah, it
was incredible.
He's dead. Soon as she said that, I thought, that's it.
Anarchic individualism.
There you go.
Well,
there you go.
You know, he will take a while to live down that fracas that took place with him and Liz. But I'd like to think, given the intellectual capacity and breadth of this man, the time will actually smooth over that error of judgment in backing her and give him another chance to show what he's got to offer. Because you made the point earlier, Rob, that, from a different background, and he was basically showing the British who they were through his erudition, his education, his learning. But, through the research, I don't see Kwasi as an outsider in that sense. He may have Ghanaian parents, but he was born here. He was educated here from start right through to his PhD. So he will have learned everything through the education system and his wider reading about our empire, about our way of doing things. And from that standpoint, I think he was just basically reflecting as a smart individual, entirely of this culture, entirely of this country, how we did it and how chaotic it was and why perhaps it had all of those fault lines. Yeah. And so from that standpoint, I see him very much as one of us. And why do I say one of us? A little bit like you, Rob. I was 8 when I joined my parents in the UK, and I'm a young man of 68. So I would claim 60 years of getting to know this country I've lived in. And, with Kwasi, he's lived his whole life in this country, and he's learned what this country is about from birth. And so from that standpoint, I just think he has more to offer. And who knows, even if he doesn't bounce back in the political environment, he may well find his way into some other sector, because he was a JP Morgan man for a time, and he wrote for the Telegraph and a number of other publications. The Guardian may surprise you, but he even wrote for them at one stage.
Yeah. So, I just wanted to ask a question, though. When people in the Windrush Nation do things, become firsts or what have you, it fills us with a sense of pride. Do you think?
Absolutely.
Do you think the fact that he reigned for such a short period has an adverse effect? Do we feel differently about him, or has he brought some sort of disrepute on ourselves? I don't know. I'm just.
Well, you have a stab at that, Rob, and then I'll come in, because I think, Mike, you'll almost certainly know where I'll be coming from. So, Rob, what do you think?
Well, I think it's an interesting lens. I think Mike poses a very interesting question. Is it the case that we attract a deeper level of scrutiny, a deeper level of assessment and critique, even from within our own, on occasions such as these? I mean, some of the impact of decisions that were certainly down to his office of Chancellor of the Exchequer are hard to recover from. Indeed, many would argue, Mike, that the economy is still trying to recover from it. ironically being led, the party anyway, the government being led by another member of the so-called ethnic minority, and the cabinet having ethnic minority members on it. And it brings to bear some of the debates that we will, I think, legitimately have about, skin folk, kinfolk, about, whether they are one of ours or not. And Dwayne puts a very powerful and a very compelling case to include Kwasi in. And I think, as I say, I think it's powerful and I think it's compelling. He is no doubt a powerhouse. He is no doubt a very intelligent man. But how could it come to be in those 38 days that he would render the pound sterling to its lowest ever level against the US dollar? How did that happen? Was that down to his acumen, or was it some outside influences, or was it the global recession that many still have not yet defined fully? There's all sorts of factors, the pandemic, all sorts of other factors. How would anyone else have fared in that place? Right back to my original point, the lens that we find ourselves, and sometimes forcing ourselves to consider, perfection as the enemy of the good. I think what it does come down to is some of the values and some of the actual politics that people stand for, and it depends on how you carry those. And I speak as someone who served inside the machine for 38 years, working up close and personal with some of these individuals, and ironically having worked with these three. And I know what I feel, certainly in my heart, about some of them, and it doesn't detract from their milestones. It doesn't mean that they weren't able to do X, Y, and Z at all. But I do think, Mike, in answer to your question, I do think that there are some members of our community that will deliver a harsher critique of his time served. And I do think, and I say this with real thought, I do think that some of that is unfair because there are some additional factors at play here. Not all of it unfair, but some of it is unfair.
Yes, because,
I don't know how you feel about that, Dwayne.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll come in after Mike. What are you going to say, Mike?
I was going to say, proud, first black chancellor. Yeah, but look at what he did, and, that's how the mentality of some people are.
Don't forget, Tallahassee Coates wrote a book, We Were 8 Years in Power. And if you speak to Cornel West or you speak to Eric Dyson at times, in the American situation, many of them will claim that Barack Obama didn't do enough in his time.
True.
And yet he puts a skip in all of our strides, doesn't he?
Well, coming back to your question about, how he is being judged, if you like. I think there was a time, and this was going back to when I was a boy, when there were very few high-profile, high achievers that we were aware of. And when any of those folks failed or fell, there was a high level of criticism all round. He wasn't deserving, you were expecting it, blah, blah, blah. However, in the 21st century, if you are looking at what's going on, there are so many from our community and from the Asian community who are making their mark, who are distinguishing themselves and also making mistakes. So we are in a generation when we're never surprised when somebody makes a mistake, because you've only got to look to your left to see another dozen, another score, another 100 like that person doing lots of wonderful things. So I think the generation that's minded to be hypercritical of any failing of a black person is receding. And I think there's a bit more objectivity. For example, Winston Churchill is one of the big heroes of this country. And there are lots of good reasons why he is so lauded. But Winston Churchill did not succeed at every turn. He had some big failures along the way. Yeah. And if you look at almost any politician out there, and, again, I'm not party political because I don't believe any of the parties are looking after my best interest. But look at the rise and fall of dear old Boris Johnson. And you can think of a lot of other MPs who have been in a similar situation. So Kwasi will have had his time when he perhaps backed the wrong horse. Let's put it that way. But if you look at his career prior to the Liz Truss situation, he backed a number of winners, and his career grew on the back of that. So, hypercriticism, I think, will die a death with time, because there are just so many more like us out there contributing.
Yeah. Well, and just to add to that, if I may, Dwayne, there are a significant number of people who would argue that the truest sign of freedom and liberty, not to take away from aspiration and wanting to be excellent and the debate around Black excellence, not to take away from any of that at all, but the truest sign of liberty and freedom is the freedom to be average and still make a living. The freedom to be who you are and make those mistakes and not be, as you put it, hypercritical, but certainly not be overly punished for it. At the end of the day, to be who you are. And as I say, that's not to detract from our aspiration to be excellent, but it doesn't have to be a prerequisite for our existence. That true liberty is to be who we are. And that is the freedom that I think.
No argument there from me, Mike. Any response on your side?
We need to take a long-term view on people, not just that instant moment that we see, but look overall. Like, we've taken the time to look overall at his life. We could have said, nah, we won't have him in there. What did he do?
Yeah.
That doesn't make any sense. No.
Yeah. Doesn't make sense.
Well, hopefully we're becoming a much more discerning Windrush nation. We're not just knee-jerking from place to place, from person to person.
Absolutely. And another element of what you say, Dwayne, that I do agree with wholeheartedly, there's more than one, but another element that I agree with, he's young enough to come again.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.